Is it okay if I stand?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Are we good?
Yeah. Okay, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Jillian Porter. Thank you so much to the Jordan Center for hosting this event, and to Sasha Shpitalnik and everyone else at the Jordan Center who have made this occasion possible. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Kirill Gorichuk today for this lecture on women filmmakers in early Soviet documentary. Kirill is a specialist of early Soviet documentary cinema who completed his MA at the Russian State University for the Humanities and his candidate of science degree at the State Institute of Art Studies in Moscow. He comes to us today somewhat misleadingly as a PhD student from the University of Cambridge. And I say somewhat misleadingly because he's already an impressively accomplished scholar whose publications include not only numerous scholarly articles and film reviews, but also several books focusing on Dziga Vertov and his collaborators. In 2020, he published the first book of Vertov's poetry, and this year he has published two books. The first of which is called Kinaki, Школа Дзиги Вертова, and the second is Жизнь врасплох, История создания человека с киноаппаратом. So those titles in English are, I think I did the order wrong, but anyway, one of them is Life Caught Unawares, History of the Man with a Movie Camera, and the other is Kinoks, Dziga Vertov's School. These books promise to be major contributions to Vertov's scholarship, and I cannot wait to read them. I'll also just mention, as a little personal anecdote, that I was introduced to Kirill virtually last year when I was trying to find the source of an advertisement for one of Vertov's films that I found online with no attribution. After asking several Vertov experts, I was eventually directed to Kirill, who promptly named the newspaper where I would indeed find the original advertisement. Thank you again for the reference. And upon learning subsequently of Kirill's ongoing dissertation research on women in early Soviet documentary cinema, I eagerly invited him to come and speak to us here at the Jordan Center. We are lucky to have been able to intercept him during his visit to the US for the AC's conference coming up this week. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kirill. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Liz. I'm really happy to be being here, and thank you for having me. It's like, yeah, it's so it's a interesting shift in my life. So yeah, without further ado, what's going on today? What will going to happen? I mean, so I'm going to share with you my current research about women in documentary film, in early Soviet documentary film in 1920s and 1930s. I have some interesting ideas in my perspective, and I want to share them with you. And yeah, as Jillian mentioned, I've been into Dziga Vertov for a long time, and I worked with his archive for years, and managed to locate and find a lot of different sources and materials. And eventually I came across like many other people who were not as much important to like film history, but they seems like very important at the moment. You know, there were so many hidden invisible figures, and most importantly, plenty of them were women. So then I realized that I need to go further, like to find out who was like behind Vertov, behind other big major like film directors and filmmakers of that time. And that's what I'm doing right now during my Cambridge PhD. So that's what I'm going to talk today about. And I wanted to start with a quote, but really from the newspaper Kino. It was a big like Soviet newspaper dedicated to film industry at that time. In 1928, they published an appeal for International Women's Day on 8th of March. So there's a quote. At the very heart of the production at the film studios, many women are at work. We must not close our eyes to the fact that women working in cinema sometimes encounter obstacles unrelated to their professional competence. it must be admitted that cinema as an institution had done little to renew everyday relations in the spirit of women's emancipation. Film has scarcely promoted the image of the new woman worker. End of quote. So this editorial article drew attention to question of women's visibility in the film industry, again in 1928, and to the structural barriers that continue to restrict the professional advancement. Basically, we can tell that by 1928, like a distinct community of women filmmakers has already emerged. According to newspaper Kino, more than 1,500 women were then employed as editors and cutters across Soviet studios, and their labor was increasingly recognized as vital to film production. This transformation did not occur spontaneously. Throughout the 1920s, women's participation in film developed in tandem with the institutional expansion of the industry, the rise of film theory, and the consolidation of Soviet film culture. So in this talk, I argue that early Soviet documentary cinema played a pivotal role in this process. So it offered, on the one hand, women crucial points of entry into film production, enabled their professionalization, fostered that emergence of a closely connected community of film workers. But on the other hand, there were many other interesting obstacles. So I would like to say something about several words about historiography, because when we speak about early Soviet documentary film, two names tend to dominate the narratives: Tsiga Vertov and Esfir Shub. So this is really important. So yet behind these celebrated figures stood many other people, particularly women whose contributions have remained largely invisible. So in my current research, I aim to kind of sort of decentralize the discourse and address the gaps and silences in film historiography. So yeah, I have Shub and Vertov somewhere here. Yeah. So here's Vertov, his wife. We will talk about her later. And there is Esfir Shub and one of this invisible women. Her name is Kupshinchka. We will talk about her a little bit today. So, which is what is interesting, that both Vertov and Shub we know the period of this period of Soviet film history. We know Vertov and Shub, but in a sense, at that time they were marginal and relatively short-lived phenomenon compared to the other documentary practitioners of, especially in the 1930s. I mean, in the perspective of their colleagues, and maybe most importantly, in the perspective of the audience of their films. So by the 1930s, leading figures and stylistic directions had changed completely. Why did this shift occur? This is one of the key questions I would like to explore. So the answer, in my opinion, lies not only in politics and censorship, shifting narratives, ideology, and all that, etc., but in the structural transformations of the industry itself. So growing centralization, bureaucratization of Soviet cinema gradually sidelined avant-garde 1920s approaches, and documentary film ceased to be viewed as an art form and became more firmly identified as journalism, reportage, chronicle, etc. And the women were deeply implicated in this transformation. Their professional ambitions, training, and pursuit of visibility were driving forces behind the institutionalization of documentary practice. Through their careers, we can trace how the documentary system evolved, how centralization on one hand curtailed creative freedom, making figures like Vertov and Shub quickly seem outdated in the 30s, but on the other, provided women with new opportunities for professional development. So in today's talk, I will focus on two generations of Soviet women documentarians. So it's my big idea that there were two generations. First came the before and after the revolution in 1917 revolution. They entered film industry, but often without formal education, technical skills, rarely with artistic ambitions. Many came to cinema out of necessity, amid unemployment and limited opportunities for women. They found work where they could, for example, in cutting rooms and laboratories across different studios. And the second generation, by contrast, was trained at VGIK, the State Institute of Cinematography in Moscow, entered a newly centralized studio system in the early 30s, And they gained access not only to film production, but also to stable housing, decent salaries, and state recognition through awards. I think I have some slides. So here are like I claim that this kind of first generation, they were mostly like invisible women without names, and they just like silently work in the editing rooms, like with this picture. And second, you can see the difference between their representation. So, and here are photos from the 30s and 40s, like very different representation of women, right? So they have like, personalities, individually, faces, right? So that's what I'm going to address today too. So by examining these two groups, I will trace how a professional community of women editors and filmmakers formed, how it influenced the industry as a whole, and why many women of the first generation were later overlooked and unacknowledged by their successors, which is really important because these two generations kind of had like rivalry between each other. But yeah, what I also wanted to point out that before turning to the first generation of women, let me check. Yeah. Just a second. So before turning to the first generation, I want to outline briefly distinguish these two cohorts of women documentarians, because this contrast is central to my argument. In the 1910s and early 1920s, there was effectively no such profession as documentary filmmaker. The term documentary itself hadn't yet emerged, and non-fiction film existed largely as a set of loosely defined practices, let's say. Newsreels, chronicles, instructional films, educational films, like science films, various forms of actuality footages. That is why most of the future documentaries started with like, different positions and roles on emerging Soviet cinema, including non-fiction and fiction films. By contrast, the generation that entered the industry in the 30s encountered a very different landscape. Documentary cinema had acquired institutional shape and ideological purpose. The establishment of the centralized documentary studio, Soyuzkinochronika, in 1931, provided not only a professional home, but also a coherent sense of identity and authorship for those working within the genre. One of the central challenges in studying the first generation of women in Soviet documentary film, and in Soviet film in general, is the scarcity of preserved sources. Unlike many later filmmakers, these early women rarely left behind memoirs, interviews, personal archives. Their names survive mostly in studio documentation, personal files, and specialized film press. An important exception comes from women who achieved a degree of public recognition and who understood a kind of historical significance of their own work, such as Elizaveta Svilova, a lifelong collaborator of VGIK, and Esfir Shub, whose compilation films secured like kind of canonical place in Soviet film history. So both women served as role models and visible embodiments of women's participation in film. And crucially, Svilova and Shub left behind recollections of their female colleagues, preserving fragments of a largely undocumented community. So to understand why so many women entered the film industry in the 1920s, we need to consider the broader social and economic context in which this third generation lived and worked. Female unemployment was one of the big social problems in the post-Civil War period. Women were typically confined to low-paid occupations that required neither specialized training nor formal education. The issue of women's illiteracy was particularly acute, and literacy campaign targeted women precisely because the majority could not read. In response, Bolshevik state created women's departments called Zhenotdeli, launched specialized journals that aimed not only to mobilize and politicize women, but also to address the persistent realities of unemployment, gender inequality, limited educational access. Yet, traditional assumptions about women's work continue to shape hiring practices. As historian Wendy Goldman has observed, women's opportunities were constrained not only by a lack of skills, but also by entrenched patterns of sex segregation and low status positions that had historically occupied an industry. And film sector reflected these broader patterns. During the First World War and the Civil War too, cinema became one of the few industries willing to hire uneducated and semi-skilled women. Many entered studios as cutters, editors, laboratory assistants, etc. Although these positions were modest and often invisible, they provided women with rare access to stable employment at a moment when social mobility was severely limited. The vast majority of these women, typically young girls without formal education, were not motivated by a desire for creative work. In fact, editing was considered at the time, it's like late 1910s, some kind of like that, and maybe even later. So in early period of Soviet rule, editing was considered at the time the most mechanical, like low-paid job. And for instance, in 1922, the film critic Valentin Turkin stated in the newspaper Kino that editing was typically carried out by women and described it as purely technical profession akin to typesetting. A similar perception of editing existed worldwide at the time. Editing was regarded as a suitable profession for women due to its association with traditional female handicrafts. The comparison of manual film cutting to knitting or sewing wasn't kind of coincidental, because some women actually entered the film industry from textile factories, the most common site of female labor at the time. So editing wasn't considered as a creative work at all, but this perception gradually changed in the early 1920s, when editing and montage came to be seen as like central creative forces of Soviet cinema. When theorists and filmmakers such as Lev Kuleshov, Sergei Eisenstein, Tigor Vertov redefined film as an art of construction, assemblage, fragments that then join together, producing meanings, emotions, convey messages, political messages particularly. So editing was no longer a mechanical task, but a form of hand labor that might build entire worlds on screen. In this new cinematic language, the editor became one of the key, if not the main, participants in the filmmaking process, shaping rhythm, structure, and viewer's perception of reality itself. And the newsreel Kinopravda, produced by Vertov and his collective film group Kinoki from 1922 to 1925, became a key platform for montage experimentation. And one of the principal editors was Elizaveta Svilova. So arguably the first woman in Soviet nonfiction film to gain public recognition and to publish in film press under her own name. Her first article was published, I believe, in 1923. So this was really something new for women in film, especially in documentary. So according to Svilova, she wrote it in her autobiography. The emergence of a new style and approach to newsreel production gradually turned editing into a form of creative labor. She recalled, quote, "In the past, shots were filmed in length of 30-40 meters from a single position. A title would be attached, and the newsreel basically was finished. Everything was done mechanically. That is how they worked then. Suddenly, our editing room began receiving footages of 20 to 30 meters, but instead of a single shot, they contained 15 to 20 shots, meaning the same number of splices, right? So cameramen were filming shorter takes and assembling them in sequence. Vertov began releasing his newsreel Kinopravda, and this was already considered rhythmic montage, not just joining the fragments of film stock, right? From that moment, the newsreel editors began to take part in genuinely creative. Cinematographer Alexander Lemberg, who also worked with Vertov in the early 1920s, recalled this shift as well. He said that he would bring candies to the editors as a reward of appreciation to their efforts in adapting the Kinopravda style, in which cameramen shot in short dynamic takes. So it signals and early recognition that the editor's work had become highly demanding, technically complex, and creatively indispensable. So although Svilova attributed this creative shift primarily to the artistic vision of her husband, Zika, it was also the institutional consolidation of nonfiction film and the public discussions surrounding its cultural and political significance that redefined and elevated the role of female editors. What is the next slide? Just okay. So yeah, in November 1924, the Kultkino studio was established on the basis of Goskino organization. And Kinopravda production moved there with Vertov's group Kinoki as well. And this is arguably it's really important point in the 1920s and the history of Soviet documentary film, because it was basically the first ever like place to produce only non-fiction films. In his article outlining the goals of newly established Kultkino in 1924, head of the studio Vladimir Stepanov announced that the studio would invite a new generation of young communist workers and would refuse to collaborate with the so-called spitsi, professional filmmakers who had begun their careers before the revolution. So there were several reasons for the decision. Firstly, Stepanov likely sought to demonstrate to the authorities that Kultkino would produce politically reliable films free from the influence of pre-revolutionary professionals. But secondly, it was a pragmatic economic strategy. By recruiting inexperienced young workers, many of whom lacked formal film training, the studio could operate at minimal cost. That was very important for Stepanov and Kultkino. It was precisely in this context that many women entered the studio to fill the professional vacuum left by the absence of experienced specialists. Stepanov granted considerable freedom to Vertov and his collective Kinoki, whom he regarded as like ideal collaborators, committed enthusiasts who shared the faith in the ideological and educational power of nonfiction film. Vertov and his group produced a range of works for Kultkino, including newsreels, advertisements, educational films, and also animation films. But Vertov also understood the opportunity Kultkino offered as a platform for self-promotion. It's also really significant for him to advertise the methods and theories of his group and his manifests and his theory. And in 1925, Kinoki completed an advertisement film about Goskino that demonstrated the process of film production within the organization. It was called the Production of Goskino in 1924, a very basic title. And it came out in 1925. And a significant portion of the film focused on Kultkino studio, depicting how commissioned films were made and featuring several members of the Kinoki collective, including Vertov himself, his brother Mikhail Kaufman on screen, and most importantly, the footage revealed the presence of numerous women working at the studio, particularly editors and laboratory staff, offering a rare visual testimony to the gender division of labor within early Soviet documentary production. But unfortunately, this film is not digitalized, and I wasn't able to show you fragments. I'm not able to show you fragments, but here's one shot from, I think. So yeah, this is the shot from this film where Vertov and Svilova works. I don't know what they're actually doing there, but it's a shot from that film. I saw it in the Krasnogorsk archive in Moscow, but wasn't able to digitalize it. It's very interesting, important film in terms of representation of women. So yeah, so seated alongside Vertov at the table was during the Kultkino staff meeting was Elizaveta Svilova. This wasn't her first appearance, in fact, on screen. She had already been represented as an editor in newsreel Kinopravda. Here are some shots from it. This one. And also in the Man with the Moon Car as well. Maybe mostly the most important, the most famous shots of Svilova at work. what is by showing Svilova and the other members of Kinoki Collective at work, Vertov sought not only to promote his group, but also to visualize the process of filmmaking itself. This reflexive gesture aligned with Vertov's broader artistic and theoretical aims to immerse the viewer in the mechanics of cinematic production and to establish a transparent dialogic relationship between filmmakers and audience. And what is really important that he built this relationship between audience and editors, not only directors and cameramen, and it can be seen in his film Man with Movie Cover as well. Svilova's on-screen presence was more than documentary self-reference. It marked an early moment of female visibility and professional recognition within Soviet cinema. But again, it was only Svilova who had the privilege of visibility, and she has her name and subjectivity and all that. And there were many others. And in one of her autobiographical writings, Svilova listed several of the women who worked alongside her during that period. Danilova, Prokhorova, Timoshkina, and Blinnikova. Fortunately, we lack personal accounts for these editors, and their voices haven't survived in the archival record. However, I was able to trace them in the contemporary press, so we will come back to them later. What is the next slide? Okay. So, while montage was gaining recognition as a creative labor, the actual working conditions of women editors in the 1920s remained extremely harsh. Beginning in 1924, the specialized press repeatedly drew attention to the dangers and difficulties faced by female cutters and laboratory workers. As newspaper Kino reported, women often worked in damp, dark rooms filled with fumes and of acid, camphor, and acetone. Another article described how editors suffer from dizziness, nausea, and intense heat caused by the harmful vapors in the air. The constant nervous tension of the work affects the entire nervous system. And in an interview with newspaper Kino, film editor Anna Prokhorova remarked that the younger workers complain that it is hard to breathe and ask to be classified as working in hazardous conditions. And Vertov himself left a vivid description of the conditions under which Kinopravda was assembled. He recalled a basement on Tverskaya Street. It was dark and very damp, an ethern floor with holes. You walk and suddenly fall through. Large, hungry rats scurry between your feet. Somewhere above, a bared window and the legs passerby. Underfoot, water from leaking pipes. You hang the strips of film high so they don't get soaked, but the dampness loosens the film stock. Scissors rust, rulers and scrapers corrode, and you sit bent over swallowing strips of film. Dawn is approaching. It is cold and damp. Your teeth chatter. End of quote. These accounts remind us that the early professionalization of editing, particularly for women, developed not in comfortable studio environments, but in physically demanding, unhealthy, and often dangerous workplaces. The creative breakthroughs of the period were inseparable from the material realities in which women labor. By the end of the decade, the difficult and unhealthy conditions under which women edited films had been widely acknowledged, and according to the press, some measures were finally being taken to address them. And in 1929, for example, the Rabbis Union for Workers in Art raised the issue of additional leave and mandatory medical examinations, and the profession was ultimately recognized as hazardous labor. These shared hardships not only shaped the editor's daily experience, but also helped them develop a sense of solidarity and collective identity. Because several women wrote to film press about their working conditions to raise the awareness. Yet, on the other hand, the public image of women editors in the 1920s became almost entirely defined by these conditions. Like most articles on women's labor in film emphasize the dangers and tedium of this work, portraying editors as essential to film production, yet invisible, overworked, and physically strained. And this representation solidified throughout the decade, producing like persistent figure of the editor as a struggling body in a dark room. There's a funny I know text from by Vlad Karolevich. He was a writer and filmmaker. He wrote a small book in 1926 called Woman in Film, and he describes Elizaveta Svilova as a solid, heavy body bent over the film, scissors in hand. He edited, quote, "She doesn't know how to answer, to explain, or to speak. She only knows how to work. She told us reluctantly. Vertov gives the idea, we all work, cameramen film what they see. I assemble it as instructed. We are all united by a single thought." End of quote. So many women, however, sought to challenge this perception, and they aspired to authorship, creative recognition, and they wished to be seen as skilled professionals engaged in meaningful and increasingly artistic work. One such figure was Olga Filimonova, an editor at Soyuzkinochronika film studio and an active member of the Proletarian Women Writers Circle affiliated with the women's journal Delegatka. Her poems, frequently published in the journal, depicted the editor's labor as invisible and monotonous, while the worker's body dissolving into the machinery, or as in one poem, into a colony of ants. I think I have this one here on the side. Yeah, here it is. Song of film editor Montajnica. I'll quote translation of one of her poems. On the screen, the picture tells you years of struggle and labor, but how this life is edited, that ought to be shown. A bright, spacious room, simple tables with glass tops, and women, ants, bending over, clapping their presses as they work. Filimonova's poetry also appeared in the issue of newspaper Kino, dedicated to women in film in 1928. And here, film editors were likened to bees assembling film frames like honeycomb cells on a cheerful rewinder. The central theme was again a desire for recognition. Quote, yeah, this is the quote from the song. I'll read it. Frame by frame is fastened like the pattern of a honeycomb. Anna's face is glowing, her gaze is proud and bright. The living screen now sings of our passionate desire that the whole working world should know our works. So Filimonova was later in the 1960s recalled by Delegatka journalist Elizaveta Svilova, who described her as someone who conveyed the emotions of women mastering new professions. This indicates that women editors were not isolated from other women's communities. At least some sought creative expression and collective solidarity. Another film editor, Timoshkina, was also a member of the same proletarian writers' circle. And her poem captured this shared longing to escape the monotony of the cutting room. One quote from her poem. The work is done, and as a weary crowd, we hurry to the place where all is new, where over mind and soul there reigns the mighty winged power of the word. So these sentiments were echoed by other invisible women whose voices appeared in newspapers and other film press. Elena Ivanova complained that her job as a cutter did not fulfill her. She aspired to become a montage editor. The next step from the cutter, basically like cutting the film stock. Svetlana Yakovleva remarked that women were merely accidental guests in film productions, but with directing or assistant directing remaining rare exceptions. Yet Yakovleva concluded that women nevertheless had every reason to be proud of their editing department as a hardworking collective of workers. Esfir Shub in her 1928 article, maybe I have it. So, okay, here it is. She wrote several articles about women editors. So in 1928 article, The Work of Editors, She claimed, nowhere, not in any other department at the film factory, would you find the same organization planning as in the department of negative editing, like full stop editing. Industrious organization, sharpness of vision, formidable visual memory, and agility and quickness of the hands. These qualities distinguish editors who perform major, important, scarcely noticed and little recognized part in the making of a picture. This collective of workers delights us with its political harmony, social activism, and a sense of absolute camaraderie towards one another. So by the late 1920s, female editors have indeed formed a collegial, visual, and almost sisterly community. So I found a really interesting photograph. Not here. Of women editors. A photograph will be published in Delegatka. It shows like Soyuzkino editors performing morning exercises together before work. A shared ritual that reinforced like sense of belonging. So I mentioned Filimonova's poetry with its imagery of ants and bees similarly casts editors as a tightly knit, almost mystical collective engaged in the extraordinary craft of assembling films and bringing them to the screen. So yeah, let's move on to the very important thing about first generation as well is like nevertheless 1920s and the new perception of editing within documentary cinema did not necessarily made it easier for women to build stable careers in the industry. So on the Cult Kino studio, figures such as Elizaveta Svilova or Irina Setkina often relied on male colleagues, whether directors or administrators, for access to professional opportunities. It is telling that one of the most notable female documentarians in the 1930s and 40s, Lidia Stepanova, over here, here she is. She began her career at Cult Kino in the mid-20s as an editor and assistant director, primarily because her husband was Vladimir Stepanov, the head of the Cult Kino studio. A similar pattern can be observed in the career of Esfir Shub. Although she did not work directly for Cult Kino at the time, she was employed in another department. Her career closely mirrored those of Svilova and Stepanov. It was her husband, constructivist artist, avant-garde theorist Alexei Gan, who introduced her to filmmaking and avant-garde circles that included poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, Sergei Eisenstein, and many others. She belonged to this avant-garde movement. So Shub and Svilova both benefited from their inclusion into these artistic networks, which provided them with visibility in the press and access to influential film administrators, for example. Other women, however, were far less fortunate. So another example of women who entered film careers, film industry because of their male colleagues, but I think we have to move on because time is running out. Yeah. So what is also interesting that okay. What's next? Plenty of information. Oh, wait. Yeah, so let's move on to 1930s because it's a completely different landscape. Let's conclude the first chapter. That in the 1920s, the Soviet documentary film revealed both the complexity and contradictions of the genre. On the one hand, it brought unprecedented visibility to the work of women editors, though only a few managed to build up their careers. On the other hand, the gradual centralization of documentary cinema and of the film industry as a whole created new institutional pathways for women to enter filmmaking and to build professional careers within it. Women's urge for recognition and professional development also played an important role in this. And a new shift in the perception of women's work in film occurred when the establishment of Soyuzkinochronika in 1931 fundamentally transformed Soviet documentary filmmaking. It consolidated production, standardized style and ideology, and at the same time opened the doors of the industry to an even greater number of women who became an integral part of its bureaucratic and creative infrastructure. So I now will turn to several representatives of this second generation, women who entered this newly established studio Soyuzkinochronika, already equipped with a formal training from VGIK and like a more defined sense of professional identity. So these women arrived not as unskilled cutters or laboratory assistants, but already as directors, scriptwriters, and cinematographers, ready to shape like Soviet documentary film. So I'll talk about several important figures in the 1930s. So first of all, I think one of the most creative and innovative documentarians of that generation was Armenian director Arsha Ovanesova. So during her study at VGIK, in 1931, she founded Pioneer, a newsreel, a children's newsreel about children and for children, basically. The newsreel focused on childhood, family, education, themes that were culturally coded as feminine, but it's like a different topic. I'm not sure we can talk about it today, but I'll mention it a little later. So Ovanesova quickly became a central figure within the documentary studio, gathering around herself several young women, scriptwriters, assistant directors, and crucially film editors. Notably, however, all cinematographers, cameramen working for Pioneer were men, as camera work remained professional and deemed unsuitable for women. So although Pioneer occupied a marginal position in the hierarchy of Soviet film, it screened in small cinemas, had almost no advertisement, and attracted little press coverage. Ovanesova used it as a creative laboratory. Together with her close collaborator, Lidia Stepanova, there she is. Yeah, she experimented with form, writing poems, humorous sketches, playful inserts, and striving to make each issue stylistically distinct. And Ovanesova even appeared on screen herself, addressing the children directly and presenting the filmmaking process as something open, engaging, and accessible. And this degree of self-reflexivity was highly unusual for the time, especially like in the 1930s. Apparently it came from like Vertov's style. Precisely for this reason, the authorities repeatedly criticized both Ovanesova and her newsreel Pioneer, and archival documents show how she struggled throughout the late 30s and 40s to defend her creative vision while simultaneously trying to preserve her position as the newsreel supervisor, until under pressure, Pioneer eventually became as conventional and I would say dull as other newsreels in the late 1930s. I also wanted to say some words about Lidia Stepanova because she's really interesting. Like her story, like she wasn't only like a close friend and collaborator of Ovanesova, but she had a really interesting story. I mean, in the late 1920s, she worked as a tram driver, and later she applied to VGIK to study screenwriting. And during her first year of study, she wrote a script about female tram driver in Kiev. She was born in Kiev, focusing on gender inequality and entrenched patriarchal stereotypes, essentially drawing her own experience behind the wheel. And the script was filmed in Ukraine in 1930 under the title "Do Not Delay the Movement," Задерживайте движение. And Stepanova later became one of the key scriptwriters for Pioneer, producing not only plots and scenarios, but also poems and songs for the newsreel. And her career kind of demonstrates how documentary work could serve as a space for this creative experimentation. Another important figure of the second generation was, yes, small article about Ovanesova. Olga Podgoretskaya. She also, most importantly, I think she was a geek student of Sergei Eisenstein. She hoped to realize her artistic ambitions in documentary filmmaking through her true aspiration. Her true aspiration was actually she wanted to become a director of fiction films, following Eisenstein, but again, this many mass majority of women, they would channel to this Soyuzkinochronika studio in the early 1930s. For example, with Ovanesova, she wanted to become an actress, and then she was her desire was to create fiction films, children films as well. But then the studio head of the studio, Victor Yasilevich, told her wait for several years, work with us in documentary department, and then we'll see. Then Ovanesova stayed at this studio for all her life. So let's go back to Podgoretskaya. She attempted to apply avant-garde montage techniques inspired by the 1920s to the new official documentary style of the 1930s, which focused on heroic pilots, collective farmers, Red Army parades, and etc., etc. Yet she found herself confined to conventional newsreels, often dealing with children and motherhood, same as Ovanesova did. So, and she also briefly collaborated with Ovanesova on several issues of Pioneering. Her trajectory reflects the narrowing ideological and aesthetic boundaries of the early Stalin era and difficulty sustaining experimental and authorial approaches within state-defined documentary formats. Third one is really interesting woman, Ottiliia Reizman. She was actually the first documentary cinematographer in the Soviet Union and a geek graduate as well. So Reizman worked hard to prove to her male colleagues that she could handle the physical and technical demands of camera work. She earned the respect of leading documentary filmmakers, including Roman Carmen, one renowned. He was renowned for his footages, for example, from the Spanish Civil War, one of the biggest documentary filmmaker at that time. But despite her skills, Reizman faced structural obstacles within the industry. She struggled to secure housing for the studio and often lacked assigned projects. Male colleagues tended to occupy the most prestigious assignments, while she was given routine shoots like parades, kindergartens, and minor events. Determined to demonstrate her abilities, Reizman became a frontline camera woman during the Second World War, filming under fire. Her footage became part of the iconic visual record of the war, yet her name was largely overshadowed in histories of Soviet war cinema by those of her male counterparts. She received none of the high awards bestowed upon them, and after the war, she repeatedly wrote complaints to the studio leadership, describing poor treatment and a lack of opportunities to show her skills. And Reizman's career showcases both the extraordinary possibilities available to women in the early 1930s, because she graduated from VGIK and immediately became one of the biggest cinematographers in documentary. But after all, she was working class girl from nowhere, basically. She was born in Belarus, and it was an accident that she became she went to VGIK. So yeah, and there were a lot of persistent barriers that limited her advancement, regardless of talent, courage, and basically sacrifice. So yeah, let's go to the conclusion, I think. So across these examples, we can see recurring patterns. So women were able to enter the profession in the significant numbers in the 1930s, but for structural reasons mostly. Because editing was coded as a women's work, and documentary film was eventually became coded with women's work. And because newly established Soyuzkinochronika studio needed to fill positions, and women often with aspiration in fiction, film, or acting, were channeled into this field. And because of centralization of Soviet film industry in the early 1930s, employment at documentary studios offered social mobility, housing, decent wages, and attracting women who might otherwise have been excluded from the film careers. And this generation, like Ovanesova, Podgoretskaya, Reizman, came into the field with a sense of authorship, but the first generation never had access to it. They lived in the same dormitories, forged study groups, worked together in the same departments. Professional identity was now tied not just to skill, but to education, recognition, and affiliation with the studio. And the community became more layered eventually, like more hierarchical and more dependent on networks of loyalty, kinship, institutional belongings. And in this rearranged landscape, Svilova and Shub, for example, no longer occupy central positions. They were like respected historically, but they were not part of this VGIK cohort and did not belong to the tightly knit circles like formed at the Soyuzkinochronika studio. Even Lidia Stepanova, who I mentioned before, she'd been protected for a time by her marriage to Vladimir Stepanov, prominent film producer even in the 1930s. But she found herself in a precarious position. Her husband was politically repressed in 1937. Her later marriage to Rafael Gikov, another big documentary director, provided stability for a time. But her survival within the studio underscores the uncomfortable truth that in this industry, women often needed male support to maintain their positions. So this brings us to the crucial question: why did this entire generation of women disappear from film historiography? As you can see that there were plenty of them, and there were many more. I mentioned just like a few, most notable. So I think there was several reasons. Their ideological alignment. So loyalty to the system, to Stalinism as a whole, as this culture of film culture, if you will. For the post-war 4 generations, their films were dismissed as pure propaganda. And the political issue certainly contributed to their erasure from the film history. And also lack of stylistic legacy, their works. They continued making these newsreels in the same narrative and aesthetic frameworks well into the 1940s and 50s. They did not transition to new styles or link themselves to the post-war generation. Their aesthetic was perceived as outdated. The style they had been trained and given, it had simply expired after the death of Stalin. And ironically, the very strategy that allowed them to enter the professions, not drawing attention to oneself, later contributed to their invisibility. This is why Vertov and Shub remain famous and iconic. They were positioned in the 4 period, respectively, as the victims of the system, victims of basically second generation filmmakers, documentary filmmakers. And the women who worked steadily and loyally within this industry were not granted the same narrative. However, many of them struggled a lot inside this very industry. That is why there were no distinct female film movement or style emerged in the 1930s and 40s. However, plenty of them worked in documentary. The pursuit of gender equality in the 1920s and 30s placed those women in some kind of loop. So they blended in so completely, or to be indistinguishable from their male colleagues, and adjusted to so strictly to these institutional norms that they were ultimately erased and disappeared with its Stalin's film culture they sought to belong to. So yeah, this is the end. So thank you for your attention. Yeah, so if you have any questions, I would love to answer.
I'm sure we have, but you go ahead, you know, just call on people since you can see folks still.
Thank you so much. This was really a fantastic talk, and
Thank you.
I've always wondered how the Soviet Union especially early Soviet Union, we end up with certain professions that are in which, the glass ceiling is broken. There's major feminization, like medicine, like university teaching, which are heavily feminized. And then there are other professions like writing, literature, you know, writers union until the very end remains 85-90% male membership, you know. And I really loved how you showed at a micro level how this happens within the very specific field of documentary cinema, which I also very much appreciated how you show how different it can be from fiction cinema. And I'm just wondering, because in the 20s and 30s, Jeanne Diel, this um, essentially feminist institution was one of the main sources of opening up fields to women. I'm wondering whether there was whether Jeanne Diel or any other external institution was applying any pressure of any kind on Soviet film institutions to open pathways for women, or whether it's really this is a completely internal story of micro dynamics within the documentary profession.
Yes, good question. Thank you. So basically, I would say that it was a very distinct and separate film culture. It was from every other institutions, but I managed to find some accounts, some articles in 1920s press. For example, Delegatka was really associated with Zhena Vili and other women networking system. I don't know. So kind of they tried to acknowledge the work of film editors, as I mentioned, the conditions of their work, and to like emphasize, highlight the troubles they are coming through. And but I think they didn't have any influence on these processes of social mobility, education, and like within the industry. And it was really tricky and complicated. I mean, in the late, like for example, Ottiliia Reizman, it was really an accident that she came to the film, because like she wanted to have her desire was to become like an engineer, like but she managed to only to find work as an assistant, like in laboratory in Belarus, one of the film studios in Belarus, Kino. And then her work was so like acknowledged as like exceptional, very like, I don't know, determined, that they promoted her into Moscow to become a student at VGIK, because VGIK called for new students from different republics, like please come to us, like give us your new cadre, new people, like new generation of people. And these processes were not like straightforward, but I can like trace, I was able to trace like only few of them. It was very like inconsistent, I would say. So basically the answer is, I think no. I mean, this Jeanne Diel, they were separate from the film industry. Film industry as a whole was very separate from every like from different institutions. And these documentarians at the time, like especially in second generation, like 30s, 40s, they considered themselves as an elite, because they had this access to Stalin and other leaders, because they shoot them, right? So they consider them like, aha, we are filmmakers, So and it was really interesting. They had this professional identity. And Ottiliia Reizman, for example, she also like wrote to her mother, and letters I found in the archives, that now I'm a like filmmaker, I'm a cinematographer, and it was very important to them, building this identity. So yeah, thanks for the question. Sure.
Can you speak at all about what happened after these two generations of women documentary filmmakers and especially editors? Was there a third generation? Did women continue to be the primary editors and cutters, or if not, why not? And yeah, just what was the subsequent development of
Yeah,
that dynamic?
yeah, the dynamic stayed mostly the same until the Stalin's death. So I found some documents and sources on. So basically, after Soyuzkinochronika was like reformed in 1939 to CSDF, Central Moscow Studio for Documentary Films, it was like a big new institution. So and they kind of remained kind of bringing students, female students from VGIK, so like a list of women from VGIK, and it was essentially no one could come to the film studio without this education, without geek education. Like basically, you come, like in the 1920s, like very random women could come to the film. But here in the 40s, just you have to, must finish your education. The third generation, it's really hard to distinguish it from the, and I'm still thinking about it. Where is this line? I would say it's like Stalin's death, like any other phenomenon of that time. Begins with like in the 50s, and another generation of women came to the film studio, but they couldn't. There were lack of opportunities to change the style. That's what I must say. Figured. Looking at the 50s, like because it's for a period, like we know that this was a period of like I don't know, reestablishing film style, trying to do it differently, right? Kind of bringing inspiration from the 20s on the one hand, on the other hand, trying to do something in the European style, like neorealism or Italian film. And all others. But in documentary, it was still very hard that many people tried to go back to Vertov and let's look at his style to recreate it. But Svilova, for example, she left the job after Vertov died, and Shub as well. She said that it's not like an environment I could work with. It's like completely different people. She felt like there was like a lack of respect to her, so it was like very complicated relationship between all these different circles and generations. And yeah, basically the answer is it stayed kind of the same, but I didn't like scrutinize it in the 60s. But until the 60s, it was basically in the state of geek. I was a faculty of documentary. It was still like very much female driven, I don't know, centralized. So until the 60s, it was the same.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the topic on this, really interesting. And what struck me is that you have two very distinct stories of the two generations, each of which are really interesting in their own right. So my question here is about sort of how these two stories fit together, the story of sort of first generation and the second generation. Because it seems that in a lot of ways even the women you're talking about are doing, for instance, very different labor. You have women who are sort of working under the directors, doing the physical cutting of the film, learning these technical skills. The articles are all women can do this work just as well as men can. And you could imagine the same article being written about driving a tractor or something like this. And then you have a second story about a group of very professionalized female directors who come up against a glass ceiling which they're unable to break through. And so I'm curious how to connect these two stories, which seem to be, to me, potentially about people doing slightly different work and sort of bouncing into Soviet institutions in slightly different ways. And this, to be clear, I think is a strength of your project. I think there's some really cool generative stuff here. I'm just curious to hear you reflect on this. I had a couple of thoughts here. One question is this a Stalinism story about the Stalin revolution comes in and professionalizes everything, and now we have these young graduates of a Soviet university coming in to try to take over the profession, and all sorts of things happen because of that? Or is that sort of in the background? I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Is this a story of further development? Is this women enter the profession and get these sort of low-paying subordinate technical jobs, but then at a certain point, some of those women are ready to push to take over, the director's chair from their former bosses, and then that, that works in some ways, but in other ways, obviously, they very much do not gain a preeminent place in cinema. Are when this second generation of women documentarians are making their films, are sort of the low-level editors, the cutters of the first generation still working now? Their bosses are women, whereas before their bosses were men, or is there a new generation of sort of lower-level technical employees? Anyway, this is a bunch of very sort of unfocused questions, and really what I'm interested in is just to hear you reflect a little bit on the sort of the movement between these two generations. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still the question I also like thinking about, and trying to figure this out, because I mean, basically the first generation, they were not able to gain positions that had second generation. That's the main link between them. So, and many of the women from the second generation actually started as film editors from the first generation, but I kind of put them into the second generation because they kind of established their career and professional identity only in the 30s. Like, for example, there was like Irina Venchar, who started in I guess like 1925, 1926. Also like at Kulkino as like very low professional, like low skill, like cutting job. But then she married Iosif Pasetsky, a very like prominent documentary filmmaker. They made a few films together, and she also like started to how to say it, go into like into ideology work as like Komsomol and party organizations within the studio Soyuzkinochronika, and it helped her to like rise and with the help of her husband as well, and they kind of formed this interesting I would say family circle. And what is also interesting, that Lidia Stepanova, who I mentioned, also was one of the relatives to the Iosif Pasitsky, like a far relatives. They kind of, it was basically like a real family, and many other documentary filmmakers, they kind of tried to fight them. And there was like also like very anti-Semitic approach, like they are Jews, like a Jew circle, and they were like a Russian circle in the 40s, like they are like Russian cameramen who fought in the Second World War. This we have to fight this. So it was like a very weird place, this central documentary studio. People like always was fighting with each other, like and the link between like the generations, that some of the people from some of the women and men as well from the first generation, they continued working within these circles, right? Trying to navigate how to work, how to survive this thing. Because one of the like maybe main nightmare, like the nightmare of every filmmaker at that time, was to get fired. Like your life basically ends. So like, for example, Raphael Gikov, the second husband of Lidia Stepanova, he was fired because he was involved in like smuggling activities during the Second World War, and he was fired. And then after like in a few months, he had a stroke and he died because he was like nervous breakdown, because he didn't know what to do, how to like what. I mean, like all his life he was a filmmaker. Now he's just like his life has ended. And so it was like a nightmare, or going to another studio, and they considered it like an exile, like going to South Republic, for example, working like, I don't know, Uzbekistan. So it's like end of career. Like, so you have to be in Moscow to gain decent salaries, housing, and many of them, also talking about link between generations, they remembered how it was in the 20s. Like they had to like navigate, how to find these opportunities to work, to find job, basically, like to find assignments to for work, and it was like a very hard life, I would say, like difficult life, but at the same time, 30s, many of the second generations, people had housing. It was a big deal. Like for example, Vertov and didn't have a flat, like just a flat until like late 1930s. He with his wife, they lived in a room in a big like dormitory, and it was a nightmare as well. He wrote it in a diary that it's just impossible to live. He only had to like spend all his time in studio because it was like the place where he could like calm down, to just stick with work, focus on work. So yeah, there were like different links between them, and they were like interconnected, and they knew each other and fought each other, with huge rivalries, and that's what I want to explore as well, and to find this theoretical approach to it as well. So not only like institutional history, but like in terms of social mobility and education, how it defined the careers, and at the same time how it put more constraints, right? So on their works, because no creative work in the 30s. Like in the 20s, you could be like Esfir Shub, which just like came up with a completely different style of filmmaking in the montage, right? And became one of the key theorists and practitioners. And in the 30s, she just couldn't fulfill right? Her expression, express her ideas, and not only her, but Vertov and many others. So basically, that's my research in brief. So, thank you for your question.
We don't have any questions online, do we? Okay, if anyone online wants to put a question in the chat or raise your hand, go ahead. Otherwise, do we have any more questions from the floor? Speak now or forever save your question. Okay, well then let's thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for being here.